The sounds of yesterday. Memories carried in music, radios, and voices of the 1950s, 60s. The past does not always return through photographs or letters. Often, it comes back through sound. A melody carried on the wind, the static of an old radio dial, the warmth of a voice announcing the evening news. These were the invisible threads that held daily life together in the 1950s and 1960s. For those who lived through these years, sound was not background noise. It was the rhythm of memory itself. Morning often began not with alarms, but with the gentle hum of a wooden cabinet radio warming to life. Tubes glowed faintly, and static gave way to the announcer's steady voice. Housewives stirred sugar into coffee while the kitchen filled with reports of the day's weather and the slow swing of a Benny Goodman tune. Fathers folded the newspaper, but kept one ear tuned to the sports scores. Children, half-dressed for school, listened to jingles that would stay in their heads long after the commercials ended. The radio was not just a machine, it was a companion, a presence that set the pace of the day. By the time the sun set, radios across America lit up again. Families leaned closer, as if the very voices inside those boxes belonged to neighbors. The Lone Ranger galloped across the imagination. The laughter of Fibber McGee and Molly spilled into kitchens, and later the evening news brought the world into living rooms that had never seen beyond the town square. In an age before television became dominant, these programs were the shared hearth, a sound fire that gathered people together. And then there was music. Music threaded itself into every ordinary and extraordinary moment. A nickel slipped into a jukebox at a corner diner could change the mood of a whole evening. The first sway to a slow ballad at a high school prom could seal a memory that lasted a lifetime. Voices like Elvis Presley, Nat King Cole, Patsy Cline, or the Supremes did more than entertain. They gave shape to emotions that teenagers and adults alike struggled to put into words. To remember those years is to recall not just the songs, but the way they lived within people. Couples danced barefoot on kitchen linoleum while the radio hummed softly. Soldiers overseas pressed record players close, hearing a familiar voice from home and feeling for a moment less alone. Children carried transistor radios to baseball fields, turning down the volume only when the crack of a bat demanded silence. For those now in their 60s, 70s, or beyond, these sounds have not vanished. They lie waiting, tucked into the corners of memory. A faint whistle of static can still bring back the comfort of a father's favorite station. A few bars of an old love song can still summon the glow of streetlights on a summer night. Even the voices of long-gone announcers return, steady and trustworthy, reminding us of a time when information arrived slowly and carefully, and when words carried weight because they were heard, not scrolled. This series revisits those sounds of yesterday, not as relics, but as living echoes. We will walk back through the mornings shaped by radio voices, the Saturday nights defined by jukebox songs, the trusted narrators who became part of every family, and the melodies that marked life's turning points. These are not just stories of technology or entertainment. They are stories of how sound shaped belonging, comfort, and memory. Because when we ask, "What do you remember most?" many will smile and answer with something they cannot hold in their hands, a song, a voice, a sound. Morning in the 1950s did not rush. It unfolded slowly, like a curtain rising on a familiar stage. The first light filtered through curtains of cotton or lace, falling across modest bedrooms where alarm clocks ticked softly but rarely needed to ring. What often stirred a household awake was not the clang of metal bells, but the sound of a radio coming to life in the kitchen. The radio was a wooden cabinet with knobs worn smooth from years of use. Some families placed it proudly in the living room, others kept a smaller one on the kitchen counter. When the tubes warmed and the static softened into a steady hum, the announcer's voice filled the air with a calm authority that seemed to belong as much to the home as to the broadcast. Good morning, America. Today will be cool with a chance of showers. A man's baritone could steady the pace of an entire household. In kitchens across small towns and cities alike, the aroma of coffee brewing joined the voice of the radio. Coffee pots hissed gently, releasing a smell that seemed to mark the boundary between night and day. Mothers poured it into thick ceramic mugs, steam curling into the morning light. Fathers sat at the head of the table, newspaper folded, sipping between glances at the sports scores read aloud from the radio. Sometimes the voice on the broadcast carried more weight than the printed words on the page. Children shuffled in, their hair still tousled from sleep, clutching bowls of cereal or toast spread with jam. Between bites they listened for their favorite jingles. A few notes advertising soap powder or toothpaste could linger in their heads all day, repeated with laughter on the walk to school. These commercials were more than clever marketing. To children, they were playful interruptions, reminders that the world outside their home also spoke to them. The rhythm of morning in the 1950s was measured by these sounds: the clink of spoons against dishes, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum floors, the faint crackle of static each time the announcer paused. The rustle of the newspaper mixing with the rising notes of a Glenn Miller song replayed from a station that still loved swing. What made these mornings memorable was not grand events, but the way the ordinary became ritual. A father tightening his tie in the mirror while the news reported on distant cities. A mother checking the lunchboxes on the counter while humming softly with the radio's tune. A child asking to stay just a few more minutes by the set to hear the end of a story before the school bus arrived. Sometimes the radio carried voices beyond the ordinary. A preacher's sermon broadcast on a Sunday morning could fill the kitchen with reverence, even if the family still had hours before church. A breaking news bulletin could silence the table, spoons held midair, as the announcer explained events in places most had never seen. For families who rarely traveled, these voices were their bridge to the world. Yet the radio was also a source of companionship. Housewives working through the long hours of laundry and ironing relied on its steady chatter. Recipes, advice programs, and favorite cereals kept them company. The familiar voices became almost like friends, returning each day to offer comfort and a sense of connection. A laugh shared through the speaker was enough to lighten the weight of chores. The transistor radio, small and portable, was beginning to appear in the late 1950s, but for most of the decade, mornings belonged to the sturdy cabinet sets that anchored the home. Families did not yet scatter with personal devices or headphones. They gathered around a single voice, a single melody, a single moment of shared attention. This unity was subtle, but it gave mornings their shape. Looking back, those mornings may seem simple compared to the distractions of later decades. Yet within that simplicity lay the beauty. The steady voice on the radio was a kind of heartbeat for the household. The music and jingles stitched themselves into memory, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were constant. Even now, for those who lived through those years, a fragment of a tune or the crackle of static can open the door to an entire scene. A kitchen lit by early sun, a steaming cup of coffee leaving a ring on the wooden table, children giggling at a jingle they already knew by heart, a father adjusting his tie as he listened for the final score. These details return with startling clarity because they were repeated so many times day after day until they became the fabric of life itself. Morning radios and coffee in the 1950s were not luxuries. They were threads that held families together in rhythm, comfort, and familiarity. To remember them is to remember a time when sound guided the day, when voices were trusted, and when the warmth of a household could be measured in the hum of a radio and the aroma of coffee drifting through the air. Saturday nights in the 1950s carried a magic of their own. After a week of work and school, the town seemed to exhale. Streets glowed with neon signs flickering against the warm air. Diners filled with the smell of hamburgers, sizzling on flat-top grills, and milkshakes poured into tall frosted glasses. It was a night when youth claimed the hours, when music rose above the ordinary and turned simple corners of America into stages of memory. At the heart of this ritual stood the jukebox, tall and gleaming, with chrome trim polished by countless fingerprints. It was more than a machine. It was a voice for a generation. A single coin could send Elvis Presley's voice rippling through the diner, or carry the harmonies of the Platters across a room where teenagers leaned close in booths. The music was not just background. It was the pulse of the evening. Young couples pressed together in the glow of neon, swaying to the rhythm. Friends laughed as they argued over which song to play next, their nickels clinking into the slot like tiny promises. The mechanical arm slid into place, lifted a record, and set it spinning with a faint crackle before the melody poured out. Each song felt like an event, shared and savored, carrying emotions that teenagers struggled to put into words. Outside the diner, cars lined the street. Chrome bumpers reflected the lights, and radios played softly through rolled-down windows. Some lingered in parking lots, engines idling as couples talked quietly, the music carrying from one car to another like a conversation without words. For many, Saturday night was not about where you went, but who you were with, and what song would forever be tied to that memory. Parents, too, had their Saturday rituals. Some stayed home, listening to live broadcasts from dance halls on the family radio, tapping their feet to the rhythms of big band tunes. Others went out, dressed in their best, to small-town dances where local bands filled community halls with swing and jazz. Laughter and music spilled out into the night, echoing down streets that seemed to welcome the joy. What made these evenings unforgettable was the way music and community wove together. In a time before headphones and private playlists, every note was shared. Teenagers discovered themselves in the lyrics of a love song. Parents rediscovered one another on a polished wooden floor. Children fell asleep in the backseat of cars as melodies floated through the night, imprinting themselves quietly into the mind. The jukebox itself became a symbol of independence. A nickel was small, but it gave a teenager control over the room's atmosphere. One choice could turn silence into laughter, or turn chatter into stillness as a ballad filled the air. For young people beginning to find their place in the world, that power mattered. It was freedom in its simplest form. And yet Saturday nights were not just about music. They were about belonging. A diner filled with chatter, the clatter of dishes, the rhythm of footsteps on a dance floor, even the quiet conversations in parked cars. All of it spoke of a community moving together in time. Each person carried their own story, yet the soundtrack bound them into something larger. Looking back, these evenings feel brighter than they perhaps were. The songs, now considered classics, were simply new hits played too often on the radio. The jukebox was just a machine that sometimes skipped. The diners were noisy, the cars too crowded, the nights too short. But memory smooths away the rough edges and leaves behind the glow of neon, the laughter of friends, and the voice of a singer who seemed to be speaking directly to you. For those who lived through it, a Saturday night in the 1950s is often recalled in fragments. The taste of a strawberry milkshake, the sound of quarters rattling in a glass jar behind the counter, the way a slow dance felt on a summer evening when the world outside seemed distant and unimportant. These fragments endure because they were not extraordinary. They were ordinary moments, made sacred by repetition and by the music that accompanied them. Today, when a familiar song plays on the radio or through a speaker in a grocery store, it is not uncommon for someone to pause, close their eyes, and smile. In that instant, the jukebox glows again, the neon lights return, and the laughter of friends fills the air. The years may have passed, but the sound remains. Saturday nights and jukebox dreams remind us that youth was not defined by the grand events of history, but by the songs that played while we laughed, danced, and loved. The music gave shape to the evenings, and the evenings gave shape to memory. Together, they created a rhythm that continues to echo long after the coin stopped clinking in the slot. There was a time when trust did not come from headlines flashing across screens or endless streams of words flowing through handheld devices. It came from voices, calm, steady, measured voices that entered American homes through radios and televisions in the 1950s and 1960s. These voices carried authority, comfort, and reassurance. They became part of the household, woven into daily life as closely as the ticking of the clock or the creak of the front porch steps. In the quiet of morning kitchens, the announcer's baritone filled the air with weather reports and local news. His voice was not hurried. He did not compete with noise. He spoke clearly, as though addressing each family personally. Mothers stirring oatmeal felt accompanied, not by a stranger, but by someone familiar. Fathers sipping coffee could almost nod in agreement with him. Children only half listened, but the sound created a background of security that lingered even when they hurried out the door. Evenings brought other voices. Families gathered around the living room radio or the early black and white television set. The announcer of the evening news spoke in a way that invited stillness. Parents set down their forks, children hushed their play, and for 15 minutes the household leaned in. These were the voices people believed. When they said the weather would be rough, farmers prepared their fields. When they reported an event overseas, townsfolk spoke of it at the barber shop the next day as though they had been present themselves. Some voices were trusted because they told stories. Radio dramas carried listeners into worlds of mystery and adventure. The narrator's tone rose and fell like the arc of a stage performance, creating suspense or laughter. Families leaned forward in their chairs, carried by nothing more than words and intonation. Long before television took over, these storytellers turned the imagination into a stage where heroes and villains battled in the minds of their listeners. There were also voices that guided faith. Sunday sermons broadcast across the airwaves reached into kitchens and living rooms. A preacher's cadence, steady and familiar, gave spiritual comfort to those who could not attend church in person. Elderly listeners sat quietly with hands folded, while younger ones paused chores just to hear the conclusion. For many, it was not just the message, but the tone that mattered, a rhythm of speech that wrapped the listener in reassurance. Commercial jingles and radio personalities had their own kind of trust. The friendly voice that recommended a brand of coffee or laundry soap became part of the family's routine. People laughed at jokes shared by morning hosts, or waited eagerly for call-in requests to hear their names spoken aloud. The connection was intimate, even if the speaker was hundreds of miles away. When television began to spread across American households in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the importance of trusted voices did not diminish. Anchors appeared not only with words, but with expressions, yet it was still their voices that carried the weight. A firm, calm tone could steady the nation in moments of uncertainty. For children watching cartoons, the voices of animated characters became companions. For adults, the hosts of variety shows felt like old friends visiting each Sunday evening. Trust came not from fame, but from familiarity. These voices were constant, They returned every morning, every evening, every week, until their presence felt as reliable as sunrise. They carried the rhythm of ordinary days, and in doing so, they built bonds of trust that survived decades. For those who grew up in that time, memory often returns in sound rather than sight. The exact features of an announcer's face may fade, but the cadence of his speech remains. The details of a childhood kitchen may blur, but the echo of a jingle can bring it back into focus. Even now, when a recording from the past plays, listeners feel a sudden closeness, as if the years have folded away and the trusted voice is speaking directly to them again. What made those voices unforgettable was not only their clarity or tone, but their place in the fabric of daily life. They told people what to expect from the weather, what to know about the world, what to laugh at, and even what to buy. They were woven into every routine, into mornings with coffee and evenings by the fire. They shaped not only how people thought, but also how they felt. Looking back, it is easy to see that these voices created a form of unity. When millions of families tuned in to hear the same announcer at the same time, they were not only listening to news or entertainment. They were sharing in a collective moment. Across towns and states, in cities and farms, the same words carried through different kitchens and living rooms, binding the nation together with a thread of sound. The voices we trusted were not distant or abstract. They were part of our homes, part of our mornings and evenings, part of our laughter and quiet reflection. To remember them is to remember a time when trust was simple, when a familiar cadence could carry both truth and comfort, and when the sound of a steady voice was enough to make the world feel smaller, closer, and kinder. There are moments in life that do not survive in photographs or journals, but live forever in the memory because of a song. A melody drifts across the years, and suddenly the scene is there again, complete with faces, voices, and feelings that time cannot erase. For those who came of age in the 1950s and 1960s, music was more than entertainment. It was the soundtrack of ordinary lives, shaping how people remembered love, loss, joy, and belonging. High school dances glowed with the sound of slow ballads. A boy in a pressed shirt nervously asked a girl to dance, and as the band began to play, they moved together across the polished floor. The memory of that moment, the scent of perfume, the squeak of shoes, the hush of whispers around them, remained tied forever to the song that filled the air. Decades later, when that same melody played on the radio, it could summon the warmth of a first embrace with startling clarity. Songs also framed evenings at home. Families gathered in living rooms where a record player spun carefully chosen vinyl. Parents swayed together while children giggled nearby. A familiar crooner's voice filled the space with tenderness, turning an ordinary Saturday night into something sacred. These moments were not dramatic. They were not staged. Yet they were preserved by music in a way no photograph could capture. For young people, songs often carried dreams larger than their surroundings. A jukebox in a corner diner could release the voice of Elvis Presley or Patsy Cline, making a small-town teenager feel part of something vast and thrilling. Lyrics spoke of longing, rebellion, heartbreak, or hope, echoing feelings that many could not yet put into words. To drop a coin into the slot and hear that first guitar strum was to feel a connection not only to the singer, but to millions of other listeners across the country. Music also traveled with those who served far from home. Soldiers carried records or listened to broadcasts that reminded them of familiar streets and voices. A single song could bridge oceans, carrying comfort across distance and reminding them of family dinners, neighborhood porches, and dances in gymnasiums. For many, music became the anchor that tied them to home during the uncertainty of war. Churches, too, filled with music that marked the rhythm of faith and community. Hymns rose from pews in voices strong or trembling, echoing through wooden rafters that had heard the same melodies for generations. These songs did more than inspire devotion. They stitched people together, making each voice part of a whole, reminding all that they were never alone. What made these songs powerful was not only their beauty, but their constancy. They appeared at every turning point of life. Couples chose them for weddings, parents hummed them while rocking infants to sleep, children memorized them while riding in the back seats of cars. The music accompanied triumph and tragedy alike, softening grief or amplifying joy. Each note carved itself into memory until life and music could no longer be separated. As time passed, many of those songs became classics. Yet for those who lived through the years when they were new, they remain more than historical artifacts. They are markers of personal history. A man might hear a familiar tune and remember the night he proposed. A woman might hum a chorus and feel again the warmth of her mother's kitchen. Entire generations recall where they were the first time they heard a particular song on the radio or the way it played at a summer fair under strings of lights. Even today, when technology offers endless playlists and music on demand, the old songs hold a special weight. They are not chosen for novelty, but for memory. A melody can slow time, taking listeners back to a porch swing at dusk, a crowded dance floor, or a long car ride with windows down. The songs framed lives not only once, but again and again, each time they returned through speakers or in the quiet hum of memory. The truth is that music gave shape to the ordinary days that became extraordinary in recollection. Without it, many moments might have faded. With it, they endure. The laughter of friends on a Saturday night, the warmth of family around a record player, the comfort of a soldier hearing a familiar voice, the devotion of a hymn rising from a congregation, all of it remains because music carried it forward. The songs that framed our lives are still with us. They remind us that the past was not only a sequence of events, but a symphony of sounds. To remember them is to hear again the heartbeat of youth, the tenderness of family, and the strength of community. These melodies do not belong only to history. They belong to memory, to love, and to the enduring truth that life itself is measured not only in years, but in the music that gives those years meaning. When we look back at the decades of the 1950s and 1960s, we do not always remember the details of each day. What remains strongest is the echo of sound, the hum of a radio warming to life in the morning, the soft clink of spoons in coffee cups as announcers read the weather, the laughter that followed a corny commercial jingle. These sounds were not ornaments. They were the rhythm of life itself. The voices that entered living rooms each day gave more than information. They gave stability. When the announcer read the news, he did more than report events. He carried trust into kitchens and parlors. He steadied hearts in times of uncertainty. He made the world feel smaller, as though even distant struggles could be understood and faced together. The same was true of the preachers, the storytellers, and the entertainers. They became companions. They were the voices we trusted. Music gave shape to memory in ways words alone could never achieve. A ballad could define a first dance. A hymn could bind a congregation into a single body of faith. A jukebox song could frame a summer evening so vividly that it returned decades later with a single note. Music turned fleeting hours into permanent milestones. It gave language to love, to longing, to joy, and even to sorrow. Together, voices and music wove a kind of fabric across American life. In small towns and cities, on farms and in suburbs, people shared experiences through sound. Families leaned toward the same radio programs. Teenagers dropped coins into the same jukebox songs. Soldiers overseas listened to the same broadcast that comforted their families at home. This shared soundscape created unity. It gave people not only something to listen to, but something to belong to. For those now in their 60s, 70s, or beyond, these memories return with striking clarity. A sudden fragment of a jingle can reopen the kitchen of childhood. A hymn can call back the hush of a Sunday morning. A love song can bring back the glow of a dance floor and the warmth of a hand held tightly. Time has passed, but the sounds remain, carrying with them the images, scents, and feelings of years long gone. What made those decades unforgettable was not only the grand events of history, but the way ordinary lives were framed by sound. Morning radios and coffee cups, Saturday nights and jukebox dreams, the voices that steadied households, the songs that framed lives. These were the elements that turned routine into memory and gave the ordinary the dignity of permanence. In our age of constant noise, it is easy to forget how precious those sounds were. They came more slowly, with more weight. People paused to listen. Families gathered together rather than scattering into private spaces. Voices and songs were not endless streams to be skipped or ignored. They were companions, woven into the very shape of daily life. As we reflect on those times, we realize that sound was not only a background to memory, it was memory itself. It was the bridge that carried love across distance, the anchor that steadied households, the music that marked life's milestones, and the thread that bound communities together. To remember the sounds of yesterday is to remember not only what was heard, but what was felt. And so, when a familiar tune plays, or the static of an old recording drifts into the air, we do not simply hear it. We step back into kitchens, diners, churches, dance halls, and porches. We hear the laughter of friends, the trust in a steady voice, the warmth of family gathered close. These echoes remind us that the past is never truly gone. It lingers in every note, every cadence, every remembered song. The sounds of yesterday live on because they framed not only moments, but lives. They remind us that memory is not silent. It sings, it speaks, it hums in the background of time. And when we pause to listen, we find ourselves again in the ordinary days that became extraordinary through the simple, enduring power of sound.